I'm 68 years old, and for 37 years I've carried the guilt of watching the most beautiful act of gratitude destroy the best man I ever knew. When an entire Bigfoot family chose to trust a human being who'd shown kindness to one of their own. Before this lung cancer takes what little breath I have left, I need someone to know about my Uncle Jeremiah Stone, about the September morning in 1987, when he freed a trapped Bigfoot mother from barbed wire that was slowly killing her, and about what happened the next day when 23 grateful beings appeared at his cabin door, seeking to repay his compassion. My name is Samuel Stone, and back then I was a 21-year-old college dropout who'd come to spend the summer with Uncle Jeremiah in his remote cabin deep in the Glacier National Park wilderness, hoping that time away from civilization would help me figure out what to do with a life that felt completely directionless. Jeremiah had been living alone in the Montana Rockies for 15 years, trapping and hunting and trading pelts for the minimal supplies he couldn't produce himself, existing in harmony with wilderness that most people would find impossibly harsh and lonely. What I never expected to witness was the moment when human compassion collided with non-human intelligence in ways that revealed the true meaning of family, sacrifice, and the bonds that transcend every boundary science claims exists between species. What happened over those 3 days in September changed everything. I thought I knew about consciousness, gratitude, and what kinds of beings possess the wisdom to recognize kindness when it's offered without expectation of reward. The Bigfoot mother, Jeremiah would later call her Grace because of the dignified way she endured suffering that would have broken most creatures, was dying when we found her tangled in barbed wire that had been strung by poachers to trap large animals for illegal harvest. She'd been caught for at least 2 days, struggling against restraints that tightened with every movement, cutting deeper into flesh that was already infected from exposure to mountain weather and the stress of prolonged captivity. But what made the discovery so profound wasn't just finding evidence that Bigfoots existed in the Montana wilderness. It was witnessing my uncle's immediate response to suffering that demanded action, regardless of what species was experiencing it. Jeremiah didn't hesitate, didn't question the implications of what he was seeing, didn't consider the potential consequences of interfering with something that challenged everything he thought he knew about the natural world. "She's someone's mother," he said, while examining the massive female trapped in wire that had been designed to kill rather than capture. "Look at her hands, Sam. Look at her eyes. This isn't some wild animal caught in a trap. This is a person who's been tortured by the kind of cruelty that makes me ashamed to be human." For 6 hours, Jeremiah worked to free Grace from restraints that had been designed by people who understood animal behavior well enough to create unescapable snares. Using every tool in his extensive collection, employing techniques learned through 15 years of wilderness survival, he slowly cut away wire that had embedded itself in flesh while speaking constantly to reassure someone who had every reason to see humans as enemies rather than rescuers. The moment when Grace finally understood that Jeremiah was trying to help rather than harm her became the beginning of a relationship that would transform both their lives and ultimately cost my uncle everything that made his existence worth living. When the last strand of wire fell away and she was free to escape back into the forest, Grace made a choice that demonstrated intelligence, gratitude, and moral reasoning that challenged every assumption I held about consciousness and culture. She didn't run. Instead, Grace remained at the trap site long enough to examine the tools Jeremiah had used to free her, to study his face with obvious intent to remember someone who'd shown her mercy, and to make sounds that were unmistakably expressions of gratitude for kindness she'd never expected to receive from a member of the species that had created her suffering. The next day, September 18th, 1987, Grace returned to Jeremiah's cabin accompanied by 23 members of her extended family, an entire Bigfoot community that had emerged from hiding to express collective gratitude for the human who'd saved one of their most beloved members. What followed was the most extraordinary example of interspecies diplomacy in human history, mediated by my uncle's absolute belief that intelligence deserved respect, regardless of the biological forms it inhabited. But the miracle of first contact between human and Bigfoot civilizations became the beginning of a tragedy that destroyed both communities. Within weeks of that historic meeting, word had spread through channels that connected local law enforcement to federal agencies, specializing in cryptid management and biological anomaly containment. The same compassion that had created trust between species became the evidence that guided military operations designed to capture beings whose existence represented strategic opportunities that bureaucrats valued more than the lives of innocent families. By October 15, 1987, Jeremiah Stone was dead, officially from a hunting accident that claimed he'd fallen from cliffs while tracking elk in terrain he'd navigated safely for 15 years. Grace and her entire family had vanished, probably captured by teams equipped with tranquilizer weapons and containment facilities designed for studying beings whose intelligence and culture represented strategic value to government agencies that saw them as specimens rather than people. The lung cancer that's killing me started growing the day I watched them load my uncle's body into a coroner's vehicle. While federal agents inventoried evidence that would guide future operations, designed to locate and eliminate witnesses, to interspecies cooperation that threatened institutional control over information about consciousness and intelligence. For 37 years, I've lived with the knowledge that the most beautiful act of gratitude I ever witnessed led directly to the murder of the best man I knew, and the enslavement of an entire family who'd chosen trust over the caution that had protected them for generations. September 16, 1987, started as one of those crisp Montana mornings when the air carries the promise of winter, and the aspen trees shimmer gold against granite peaks that seem close enough to touch. Uncle Jeremiah and I were checking his trap lines along Wolverine Creek, a routine we'd established during my month-long stay at his remote cabin, when we heard sounds that immediately triggered every protective instinct my uncle had developed during 15 years of wilderness living. Something was crying in the forest, not the normal vocalizations of known wildlife, but sounds that carried the specific anguish of a conscious being experiencing prolonged torture. The cries were coming from about a half-mile upstream, in an area where Jeremiah never set traps because it was too close to established game trails that legitimate hunters might use for tracking elk and deer. "That's not right," Jeremiah muttered, loading his rifle while scanning the forest for signs of whatever was generating such distressing sounds. "Nothing makes noise like that unless it's being hurt by something that don't belong in these mountains." We followed the sound through terrain that showed clear evidence of recent human activity: boot prints in soft earth, broken branches that indicated passage by people unfamiliar with wilderness travel, and equipment caches that suggested organized operations rather than casual hunting or hiking. Someone had been systematically working this area with tools and techniques that Jeremiah immediately recognized as illegal. "Poachers," he said, while examining wire snares that had been positioned to intercept animals traveling along natural corridors between water sources and feeding areas. Professional ones with military training and equipment designed for capturing live specimens, rather than just killing for pelts or meat. The snares were sophisticated examples of trap construction that demonstrated both engineering knowledge and complete disregard for animal welfare. Made from aircraft cable rather than traditional trapping materials, they were designed to tighten progressively as captured animals struggled, creating slow strangulation that would weaken large creatures without killing them immediately. But what we found at the source of the crying challenged every assumption either of us held about what kinds of beings might exist in the Montana wilderness. Tangled in the most complex of the wire snares, bleeding from dozens of cuts where cable had embedded itself in flesh, was something that belonged in folklore rather than reality, but whose suffering was undeniably real and immediate. Grace was massive, easily 8 feet tall even in her partially collapsed position, covered in dark brown fur that was matted with blood and dirt from days of struggle against restraints that had been designed to make escape impossible. Her proportions were human-like, but scaled for someone adapted to forest life in ways that suggested evolutionary paths divergent from our own species. But it was her face that shattered my skepticism, and replaced it with immediate recognition of consciousness and intelligence. Despite features that were clearly non-human, pronounced brow ridge, broader nose, jaw structure adapted for different dietary requirements, her expression was unmistakably that of someone experiencing not just physical agony, but the psychological torment of understanding that she was dying slowly, while unable to protect the family that depended on her. "Jesus Christ," Jeremiah whispered. approaching slowly with his hands visible and speaking in the calm voice he used with injured animals. "Ma'am, I don't know if you can understand me, but we're going to get you out of this mess. Just hold still, and let us figure out how to cut these wires without hurting you worse." Grace's response was immediate and profound. Instead of struggling against our approach or showing aggression toward humans who might represent additional threats, she became completely still and watched our movements with the focused attention of someone evaluating whether help had finally arrived or if her situation was about to become even worse. The intelligence in her eyes was unmistakable and heartbreaking. This wasn't a wild animal caught in a trap through random misfortune. This was someone who understood exactly what had happened to her, who recognized that the wire restraints had been deliberately positioned by humans who wanted to capture, rather than kill, large forest dwellers, and who was making conscious decisions about whether to trust the two men who discovered her suffering. Jeremiah began the rescue immediately, using wire cutters from his trapping kit to address the most life-threatening restraints while explaining every action he took. "I'm going to cut the wire around your throat first, because that's what's making it hard for you to breathe," he said while positioning his tools. "This might hurt some when the pressure releases, but it'll help you get air into your lungs." Grace endured the rescue process with remarkable stoicism, occasionally wincing when wire extraction caused additional pain, but never pulling away or interfering with Jeremiah's work. She watched his face constantly, clearly trying to understand his intentions and evaluate whether his apparent kindness represented genuine concern for her welfare. "She's been here at least 2 days," Jeremiah observed while working on restraints that had cut deep into the flesh around Grace's wrists and ankles. "Probably longer, based on how infected these cuts have become. Whoever set these traps meant to weaken large animals until they could be collected alive by people with tranquilizer equipment. The complexity of Grace's entanglement required nearly 6 hours to resolve safely. Each wire had to be cut individually to prevent sudden releases that might cause additional injury, and many of the restraints had embedded so deeply that removal required careful excavation of cable from wounds that would need immediate medical attention. Throughout the entire process, Grace demonstrated behavior that challenged everything I thought I knew about consciousness and cultural development. She assisted with the rescue when possible, positioning her body to give Jeremiah better access to difficult restraints. She showed obvious gratitude for each small improvement in her condition. Most remarkably, she began making soft vocalizations that seemed designed to maintain communication with her rescuers, ensuring that they understood her cooperation and appreciation. The moment when the last strand of wire fell away from Grace's body became a turning point that transformed a simple rescue operation into the beginning of the most profound interspecies relationship either my uncle or I had ever witnessed. Instead of immediately fleeing back into the forest where she'd be safe from human interference, Grace remained at the trap site long enough to examine Jeremiah's tools, study his face with obvious intent to memorize someone who'd shown her unprecedented kindness, and demonstrate gratitude that transcended every boundary between our species. Grace's first act of freedom was to touch Jeremiah's hand with her own, a gesture so unmistakably human in its meaning that it took my breath away. Her hand was enormous, easily twice the size of Jeremiah's, but she touched him with the gentleness of someone expressing gratitude for life-saving assistance, and her eyes held depths of emotion that were heartbreakingly familiar. "You're welcome," Jeremiah said simply, understanding that complex language wasn't necessary to communicate the essential meaning of their interaction. "I hope your people know enough medicine to treat those cuts properly. They're going to need attention that I can't provide with the supplies I carry." Grace's response revealed the first evidence of her remarkable intelligence and cultural sophistication. She gestured toward the trap site, then toward the forest, then back to Jeremiah himself, in a sequence that clearly communicated her understanding of the situation and her intention to remember both the location and the identity of her rescuer. But more than gratitude, Grace demonstrated strategic thinking that suggested sophisticated understanding of human behavior and the potential consequences of the contact she'd just experienced. She spent several minutes examining the poaching equipment that had been used to capture her, clearly memorizing details that would allow her people to recognize and avoid similar traps in the future. She's learning about how these traps work, Jeremiah observed as Grace studied the wire construction and trigger mechanisms that had made her capture possible. This isn't random curiosity. She's gathering intelligence that she can share with others of her kind to prevent them from experiencing what she went through. Grace's departure was as deliberate and dignified as everything else about her behavior during our encounter. Instead of simply disappearing into the forest, she positioned herself at the edge of the clearing and made a series of vocalizations that were clearly directed toward Jeremiah and me. Sounds that rose and fell like language, like promises or commitments that we couldn't translate but could certainly recognize as meaningful communication. "I think she's telling us that this isn't goodbye," I said while watching Grace's elaborate farewell ceremony. "The way she keeps looking back at us suggests she's planning to see us again, maybe to bring others who need to know that not all humans are enemies." Jeremiah's prediction proved accurate the following morning, when Grace returned to our camp accompanied by evidence that our rescue had created ripple effects throughout her community. Fresh footprints around our cabin showed that multiple large beings had approached during the night, close enough to study our equipment and behavior patterns, but maintaining enough distance to avoid unwanted contact. The surveillance continued throughout September 17th, with clear signs that Grace's family was conducting careful observation of our activities while evaluating whether the humans who'd helped their relative represented opportunities for broader cooperation or potential threats that needed to be managed through other means. "They're watching us," Jeremiah noted while examining tracks that appeared overnight around our cabin perimeter. "But they're not threatening. This feels more like they're trying to decide if we can be trusted with knowledge about their community." The answer came at dawn on September 18th, when Grace appeared at the edge of our clearing, accompanied by what could only be described as a formal delegation from her people. 23 adult Bigfoots arranged themselves in a protective formation that demonstrated both military discipline and obvious peaceful intentions, creating the most extraordinary sight any human had ever witnessed. Grace herself had been treated by healers whose medical knowledge surpassed anything available in human wilderness medicine. Her wounds were cleaned and dressed with plant-based preparations that showed no signs of infection. Her movements demonstrated complete recovery from injuries that should have required weeks of professional care, and her overall condition suggested access to therapeutic techniques that combined traditional healing with sophisticated understanding of tissue regeneration. But the most remarkable aspect of her return was the obvious respect and authority she commanded within her community. Grace was clearly someone whose opinions carried significant weight in group decision-making, and her positive assessment of Jeremiah's character had influenced an entire extended family to risk exposure for the purpose of expressing collective gratitude. The formal greeting ceremony that followed revealed cultural sophistication that challenged every assumption anthropology made about intelligence and social organization. Each family member approached Jeremiah individually, offering gifts that demonstrated both artistic skill and practical value. Carved tools made from materials I couldn't identify, preserved foods that would sustain human nutritional needs, and medicinal preparations that suggested centuries of accumulated knowledge about treating injuries and illnesses. "They're welcoming me into their community," Jeremiah realized as the gift-giving ceremony continued. "This isn't just gratitude for helping Grace. This is formal adoption into their extended family structure." The integration process revealed that Grace's people had been observing human behavior for generations, developing sophisticated understanding of our technology, social customs, and individual psychology. They knew about Jeremiah's solitary lifestyle, his respect for wilderness preservation, and his obvious lack of connection to the kinds of humans who might exploit contact with their community for commercial or scientific purposes. But what none of us understood was that our extraordinary encounter was being observed by people whose commitment to maintaining institutional control over information made our knowledge dangerous beyond calculation, and that the trust Grace's family had placed in human goodness would ultimately lead to the destruction of both communities. Living with the secret of Grace's family required constant vigilance against discovery by the wrong people, and by early October it became clear that our extraordinary encounter had attracted attention from federal agencies that specialized in investigating reports of anomalous biological activity in wilderness areas. Uncle Jeremiah's remote lifestyle, which had protected him from government interference for 15 years, suddenly became a liability when his compassionate rescue of a Bigfoot mother triggered surveillance operations designed to locate and contain beings whose existence challenged official understanding of North American wildlife. The signs of monitoring began subtly. Aircraft that flew lower and slower than normal Park Service patrols, strangers asking questions about unusual animal activity in areas where Jeremiah conducted his trapping operations, and equipment caches that appeared overnight near his cabin without any official explanation. Someone was conducting systematic investigation of reports that connected unusual large primate sightings to specific geographical locations and individual human witnesses. Jeremiah's integration into Grace's community had deepened beyond simple gratitude into genuine friendship that transcended species boundaries. The family visited our cabin regularly, bringing gifts and sharing knowledge about wilderness survival techniques that their people had developed over centuries of living in harmony with forest ecosystems. Grace herself had become a frequent companion during Jeremiah's daily activities, accompanying him on trap lines and hunting expeditions while teaching him about medicinal plants and weather prediction methods that surpassed anything available in human survival manuals. But the most profound aspect of their relationship was emotional rather than practical. Grace had clearly adopted Jeremiah as an honorary family member, including him in ceremonial activities and decision-making processes that revealed sophisticated cultural practices developed over generations of protecting their community from human discovery. She trusted him with knowledge about their territorial boundaries, their child-rearing customs, and their spiritual beliefs that connected them to forest consciousness in ways that human religion had never achieved. "She's showing me things that no human has ever seen," Jeremiah told me during one of our evening conversations beside the cabin's wood stove. "Grace's people have been studying our species for generations, learning our languages and understanding our technology, but they've remained hidden because they understand that contact with most humans would mean death or imprisonment for their families." The trust Grace's community had placed in Jeremiah was simultaneously the greatest honor of his life and the source of increasing anxiety as evidence accumulated that their secret was no longer secure. Federal surveillance had intensified beyond casual monitoring into active preparation for operations designed to capture specimens for research purposes that would treat conscious beings as laboratory subjects rather than people deserving of protection and autonomy. Most ominously, I discovered that our radio communications were being intercepted by agencies that weren't part of standard Park Service operations. Equipment I didn't recognize had been installed at communication relay points throughout the region, and conversations between Jeremiah and supply contractors in nearby towns were being recorded and analyzed for references to unusual wildlife encounters or changes in normal behavioral patterns. They're building a case file, I realized, while examining surveillance equipment that had been concealed near our cabin. Someone has connected Grace's rescue to broader reports about Bigfoot activity, and they're preparing for systematic hunting operations designed to locate and capture her entire family. Jeremiah's response to this discovery revealed both his protective devotion to Grace's people and his growing understanding that their friendship had created vulnerabilities that threatened everyone involved. He began teaching Grace's family about human surveillance methods, helping them recognize and avoid the technological tracking systems that federal agencies used for monitoring large animal populations in wilderness settings. But Grace's community faced an impossible choice between maintaining the friendship that had brought them joy and accepting isolation that might preserve their safety from people who would see them as valuable specimens rather than conscious beings deserving of respect. Their integration with Jeremiah had provided benefits: medical knowledge that had saved lives, technological innovations that improved their living conditions, and emotional connections that enriched their cultural experience. But it had also exposed them to dangers that their ancestors had successfully avoided for centuries. The crisis intensified on October 10th, when Grace brought disturbing news about federal teams that had been systematically searching territories throughout the Montana wilderness. Using helicopters equipped with thermal imaging and ground teams trained in tracking large animal populations, agents were conducting operations that suggested specific knowledge about Bigfoot behavior patterns and habitat preferences. "They know where we live," Grace communicated through the sophisticated sign language she'd taught Jeremiah over previous weeks. Metal birds fly over our homes every day now, watching with eyes that see heat and movement through trees. Some of our people want to flee deeper into mountains, but others say running only delays capture by humans who have machines that can follow us anywhere. Jeremiah understood that Grace's family was approaching a decision point that would affect their survival and their relationship with the human who'd become part of their extended family. They could abandon their territory and their friendship with him to seek safety in regions so remote that federal surveillance would be impractical, or they could remain near the cabin, where they'd found acceptance while risking capture by people who would destroy their community to advance research objectives. The choice was complicated by Grace's pregnancy, a development that made relocation dangerous while also creating additional motivation for protecting family members who represented the future of their people. Grace needed the medical support and nutritional resources that her community's traditional territory provided, but she also needed protection from hunters who would see her unborn child as an especially valuable specimen for studying Bigfoot reproduction and development. "I won't let them hurt your family," Jeremiah promised Grace during what would prove to be their final conversation. "If federal agents come looking for you, I'll mislead them away from your territory and give you time to escape to safety. Your people saved my life by showing me that intelligence and consciousness take forms I never imagined possible, and I'll die before I let anyone harm the beings who've become my real family." October 15th, 1987, dawned gray and bitter cold, with the kind of Montana wind that cuts through layers of clothing and carries the scent of snow from peaks already white with winter's early arrival. Uncle Jeremiah had been awake since 3 a.m., monitoring radio frequencies for signs that federal hunting operations were moving into our area, when the sounds of helicopters approaching from multiple directions announced that Grace's worst fears had become reality. The operation was coordinated with military precision, involving teams that had obviously been planning this assault for weeks. Specialized aircraft equipped with thermal imaging surrounded our cabin, while ground forces positioned themselves to intercept escape routes that Grace's family might use to retreat deeper into wilderness areas. Agent Harrison, the federal coordinator, had brought enough firepower and containment equipment to capture an entire Bigfoot community, while eliminating any human witnesses whose knowledge might threaten operational security. "Mr. Stone, you're harboring unidentified biological entities that pose potential threats to national security," Harrison announced through amplified communication systems while his teams established perimeter control around our cabin. "You have 10 minutes to surrender any specimens in your custody and provide full cooperation with federal seizure operations." Jeremiah's response revealed the courage that had defined his entire life and would characterize his final hours. Instead of cooperating with people who saw Grace's family as specimens to be collected, he activated emergency signals that he and Grace had developed to warn her community about exactly this type of situation. "These aren't specimens," Jeremiah called back while positioning himself between federal agents and the forest areas where Grace's people might approach our location. "These are families with children, with elders, with the same rights to life and freedom that you demand for your own relatives. I won't help you capture people whose only crime is existing in forms that your science doesn't understand." But Grace made the choice that sealed both their fates. Despite Jeremiah's warning signals, despite the obvious danger that approaching our cabin would represent, she emerged from the forest carrying her newborn infant, a baby who'd been born 3 days earlier with assistance from healers whose medical knowledge had ensured safe delivery, despite the stress of hiding from federal hunting operations. Grace's appearance with her child was both the most beautiful and most tragic moment I've ever witnessed. She approached our cabin with the dignified courage of someone determined to protect her family while expressing gratitude to the human who'd risked everything to help them survive. Her infant was perfect, a tiny being who represented hope for the continuation of a people who'd managed to remain hidden from human detection for countless generations. "I bring my daughter to meet the man who saved her mother's life," Grace said in English that demonstrated months of language learning with Jeremiah's patient instruction. "She should know that not all humans are enemies, that kindness exists even among the people who hunt our families." Agent Harrison's response revealed the mindset that made negotiation impossible and tragedy inevitable. "Ma'am, You're an unidentified biological entity harboring what appears to be an infant specimen of significant scientific value. Both subjects will be detained for comprehensive study and evaluation by qualified research personnel. What followed was the systematic destruction of the most beautiful friendship I'd ever witnessed. Grace was tranquilized despite Jeremiah's desperate attempts to position himself between her and federal agents, equipped with weapons designed for capturing dangerous animals. Her infant was separated from her arms while she was still conscious, loaded into containment equipment designed for transporting valuable research subjects. Jeremiah's resistance to this atrocity was immediate and violent. Despite being outnumbered by trained agents with military weapons, he fought to protect Grace and her child with the fury of someone whose family was being destroyed by institutional cruelty. He disabled communication equipment, scattered containment supplies, and managed to create enough chaos that several members of Grace's extended family escaped capture by fleeing deeper into wilderness areas that federal teams couldn't immediately access. But his heroism cost him everything. Agent Harrison's final report would claim that Jeremiah Stone had died in a hunting accident while tracking elk in terrain he'd navigated safely for 15 years. The actual circumstances of his death, beaten and tortured by federal agents seeking information about Bigfoot community locations, then executed to prevent testimony about illegal capture operations, would never appear in any official documentation. Grace disappeared into research facilities designed to unlock whatever biological secrets her species might reveal about human evolution, genetic engineering, and potential military applications that bureaucrats had been fantasizing about since the first credible Bigfoot reports crossed their desks. Her infant daughter became a test subject for studying cognitive development and learning capabilities that might advance understanding of consciousness and intelligence in non-human species. For 37 years, I've lived with the knowledge that my presence as a witness to Grace's rescue led federal agencies to the most compassionate interspecies relationship in human history. I watched them load Uncle Jeremiah's body into a coroner's vehicle, while Grace's anguished calls for her stolen daughter echoed through mountains that would never again shelter the family that had chosen trust over the caution that had protected them for generations. The lung cancer that's killing me started growing the day they murdered my uncle, for believing that intelligence and consciousness deserved respect regardless of the biological forms they inhabited. Somewhere in underground laboratories that don't officially exist, Grace spends her days as a research subject for people who will never understand that they're torturing someone whose capacity for love and gratitude put their own humanity to shame. Uncle Jeremiah believed that protecting innocence was worth any personal cost. That friendship transcended species boundaries, and that courage meant choosing compassion over safety when lives were at stake. When federal agents destroyed him for those beliefs, they robbed the world of evidence that consciousness and culture exist in forms we've never been brave enough to acknowledge or protect. Grace's daughter would be 37 years old now, assuming she survived 4 decades of scientific study. She'll never know that her life began with an act of interspecies mercy, or that her mother trusted human goodness enough to risk everything for the chance to express gratitude to someone who'd shown them that kindness could exist even among their greatest enemies.